I set the last dish on the counter and dried my hands on the kitchen towel the way I had done 10,000 times before. The house smelled like roasted garlic and rosemary, and outside the window the October sun was dropping low and gold over the neighbor's oak tree. It was a beautiful evening. I kept telling myself that. I kept trying to hold on to that. My son was bringing her to dinner. Her name was Claire. He had told me about her in pieces over several months, first just a name dropped casually in a phone call, then a photograph he texted me on a Sunday morning, then longer stories about who she was and where she came from and what made her laugh. By the time I actually met her, I already knew I was going to love her. Some things you just sense before they happen. What I did not anticipate was my sister-in-law. I should explain, Patricia. She was my late husband Robert's younger sister, and she had spent the better part of 60 years perfecting the art of making other people feel small. Robert used to say she was born with a silver spoon in her mouth and grew up to sharpen it into a weapon. After he passed 3 years ago, I had hoped to quietly let that relationship fade. But Patricia had inserted herself firmly into my son's life, his promotions, his milestones, his celebrations, and I had never quite figured out how to remove her without causing the kind of scene Robert always begged me to avoid. So when Daniel was named chief of surgery at 34 years old, and Patricia immediately offered to host the celebration dinner at her house, I said yes before I had time to think it through. Her house was bigger. She had a dining room that seated 14, and Daniel was so proud, so genuinely happy, that I would have agreed to hold the dinner on the moon if it meant seeing that look on his face stay a little longer. That was my first mistake. Claire grew up in a small town in eastern Kentucky. Her father worked at a lumber yard until his back gave out, and her mother cleaned houses and saved every dollar she could find to keep Claire in school. Claire had put herself through nursing school on loans and scholarships and 2 part-time jobs, and she had worked her way into one of the best emergency rooms in the city through nothing but skill and an absolute refusal to quit. She was 31 years old, and she had already been cited twice for exceptional patient care. My son, who had been trained by some of the finest surgeons in the country, called her the most competent person he had ever met in a hospital. She was also warm in a way that caught you off guard. The first time I met her, she brought me a jar of blackberry jam her mother had made, wrapped in brown paper with a little piece of twine. She looked me in the eye when she talked to me. She laughed easily and she listened carefully, and when Daniel reached for her hand across the table, she turned toward him like a sunflower turning toward the light. I watched them together and I thought, this is it. This is the one. Patricia looked at Claire and saw a woman who had grown up without money. That was all she needed to know. The dinner was on a Saturday in early October. Patricia's house was the kind of place designed to remind you of the distance between you and the people who lived in it. High ceilings, oil paintings in heavy frames, a dining table that had apparently belonged to some relative of Robert's who Patricia had been invoking as social currency for 30 years. There were 14 of us seated around it. Candles, good wine, a caterer Patricia had hired who moved through the room silently and efficiently. Daniel sat at the center of one side of the table, Claire beside him, their shoulders almost touching. He was wearing the watch Robert had left him, and seeing it on his wrist did something to my chest that I had not entirely prepared for. I was seated 2 chairs down from Patricia's husband Gerald, a quiet man who had married into the family money and spent the decades since working hard to be invisible. He smiled at me when I sat down. I smiled back. We understood each other. The first hour was fine. We ate and talked and laughed, and Daniel told the story of finding out about the promotion his chief had called him into the office, and Daniel had assumed it was about paperwork, and the table laughed at the right moments, and Claire put her hand on his arm when he got to the ending, and it was exactly the kind of evening I had wanted it to be. Then Patricia stood up. She lifted her wine glass and tapped it lightly with a butter knife, and the table quieted. She had a way of commanding a room that Robert always said she had learned from their father, a man I had met exactly 4 times and had never once felt comfortable around. Patricia smiled the way she always smiled, wide enough to look gracious, tight enough to mean something else entirely. She talked about Daniel first, how proud she was of him, how Robert would have been proud. She said his name carefully, the way you set something fragile on a shelf, and I felt the familiar ache move through me and settle. Then she turned toward Claire. She said she was so pleased to welcome Claire into the family circle. She said it with exactly the kind of warmth that had a floor under it. She said she admired how far Claire had come, how remarkable it was, really, to come from such a, and here she paused, tilting her head just slightly, such a modest background, and find herself at a table like this. She said the word modest the way you say it when you mean something else. She said it was clear that Daniel had seen something special in Claire, something that transcended, and she let the word hang there like smoke, transcended the differences in she paused again, their experiences. Then she said she hoped Claire understood what a significant step this was, for everyone involved, and she lifted her glass. 13 people lifted their glasses. I did not lift mine. I was watching Claire. Claire's jaw had not moved, her expression had not cracked, but she had gone very still in the particular way that people go still when they are absorbing a blow and deciding whether to fall. She was looking at the table just in front of her plate, and her hand had moved off Daniel's arm, very slowly, and settled in her lap. Daniel was still smiling because he had not entirely understood what had just happened. And that was the cruelest part, watching him look at his aunt with genuine affection, while the woman he loved sat beside him, quietly swallowing something that should never have been said. Patricia sat down. The table resumed. I picked up my water glass and I took a long, slow drink, and I looked across the table at Gerald. And Gerald was looking at his food, and I thought about Robert. I thought about something Robert had told me a long time ago. In the kitchen of our first house, standing at the sink, his voice very quiet. He had told me that his father had made a decision that was not fair, that there had been money that should have gone another way. He said it like a man confessing something he had not caused but felt responsible for nonetheless. I had never forgotten it. And I had never forgotten what I found in his desk, 6 months after he died, in a manila envelope labeled simply, "For Margaret, when the time comes." I excused myself from the table. I went to the hallway where I had left my bag on the chair by the door, the way I always did, the way I had done 100 times in this house. I opened it, and I took out the envelope. I had been carrying it for 3 years, waiting for a moment I could never quite define, waiting to know when the time came. I walked back to the dining room doorway, and I stood there for a moment, looking at the table, at my son's profile, at Claire, who had recovered her expression and was answering a question from someone across the table with a smile that cost her something to produce, at Patricia, who was cutting her food with the precision of a woman who had never once questioned her right to be exactly where she was. I walked to my chair. I sat down, and I said, fairly quietly but clearly enough for the table to hear, that I had something I would like to share if Patricia did not mind. Patricia looked at me with the expression she always used when she was deciding whether to be annoyed. She said, "Of course." I said I wanted to make sure Claire knew something important before she became part of this family. The table shifted, the particular silence of people who sense that something is about to change. I said I wanted her to know about the Hargrove account. Patricia's fork stopped moving. I said it the way you say something you have said many times in your own head, clearly, evenly, without drama, because the thing itself is dramatic enough that it does not need your help. Robert had told me years ago, I said, that his father had managed the family investment holdings jointly with a business partner for nearly 20 years. A man named Earl Whitfield, who had grown up with Robert's father, who had trusted him completely. In the late 1980s, Robert's father had begun quietly redirecting returns from a jointly held account, the Hargrove account, into a separate fund that only he controlled. He did it in small increments over 11 years, the way you move water with a spoon, slowly enough that the level barely seems to drop. By the time Earl Whitfield's family realized something was wrong, the redirected funds totaled just under $4 million. Earl Whitfield died in 1999 without ever seeing a resolution. His family had tried twice to pursue legal action and been turned back both times because Robert's father had lawyers and they did not. The money, I said, was never returned. It became the foundation of the fortune that Patricia had inherited, the house we were sitting in, the table we were eating at. I set the envelope in the center of the table. I said Robert had collected the documentation over many years because he believed his father had done something wrong and he could never quite let it go. Correspondence, bank transfer records, A letter from Robert's father to his own attorney that was explicit about what he was doing and why he believed he could do it without consequence. Robert had kept it because he was that kind of man, the kind who holds on to evidence of what was done wrong, even when he does not yet know what to do with it. And then I said that I had spoken to Earl Whitfield's granddaughter the previous spring, a woman who was now 53 years old and living in Virginia, who had grown up in a family that struggled financially for reasons her parents could never fully explain to her. She had been very gracious on the phone. She had cried a little. We had talked for a long time. I said I had been in contact with an attorney since July. The room was completely silent. I looked at Patricia. She was not cutting her food anymore. She was not looking at me with the expression she used to manage rooms. She was sitting very still, and her face had changed into something I had never seen on it before, something stripped of its careful architecture, something that looked, underneath, remarkably like fear. Gerald set down his fork. I looked back at Claire. She was looking at me with very wide eyes, and I could see that she was trying to understand what had just happened and what it meant, and I wanted to reach across the two chairs between us and take her hand, but I did not do that yet. I just looked at her steadily, and I hoped that she could hear what I was actually saying, which was not just the story about the money. The story about the money was true, and it mattered, and it was going to have real consequences. But that was not what I was saying to her. What I was saying was, you did not come from humble beginnings. You came from people who worked hard and kept their word, and never took what was not theirs. That is not modest. That is not something to transcend. That is a foundation that some people at this table would not recognize because they have never had to build one. Daniel had gone very quiet beside her. He was looking at his aunt with an expression I had never seen on his face before, the expression of a person who has just watched a door open and seen what was behind it, and cannot yet decide if he is angry or just sad. I said I was not raising this to cause pain. I was raising it because the truth does not stop being true because it is inconvenient. And because I had sat at this table for 30 years watching Robert's family use the idea of their own legacy as a way to make other people feel like guests. And I was done with it. I had been done with it since the morning I opened that envelope. I said I thought Claire deserved to know the actual history of the family she was marrying into, and I thought Patricia might want to have a conversation with her attorney before she hosted any more dinners. I picked up my wine glass. I took a sip. Nobody moved for what felt like a very long time. Then Gerald stood up and said he was going to call someone, and he walked out of the dining room, and his footsteps went down the hall, and then it was just the rest of us. Patricia did not say anything for the remainder of the evening. She sat in her chair, and she was very correct and very quiet, and the caterer came and cleared plates with perfect professionalism, and eventually people began to speak again in the careful way of people reassembling after something significant. But the room had changed. The geometry of it. The distances between people. Daniel found me in the kitchen afterward, when the guests had started filtering toward the door. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and then he came and stood beside me, and he did not say anything for a little while. Then he said he wished his father had told him. I said his father had wanted to handle it himself and had run out of time. Daniel nodded slowly. He asked me how long I had been carrying it. I said 3 years. He put his arm around me, and we stood there for a moment in his aunt's kitchen with the sound of the caterer stacking dishes in the next room. He said he was going to go find Claire. I said that was a very good idea. What happened in the months after that was not simple or clean, because the truth rarely produces simple or clean outcomes. It produces real ones. Patricia and Gerald retained 2 attorneys and spent a considerable amount of money attempting to characterize the documentation as incomplete, inadmissible, the product of a family misunderstanding. They were not successful. Earl Whitfield's granddaughter, whose name was Donna, had her own attorney by November, and the civil proceedings that followed moved slowly the way these things do, but they moved. I will not tell you Patricia lost everything. That would be a tidy ending, and life is not a tidy story. What I will tell you is that the house was sold 18 months later. That Gerald retired quietly from 2 boards he had sat on for years. That the settlement, when it came, was private. But Donna called me when it was done, and she cried again, and this time I cried too, and we agreed that it was not enough. It was never going to be enough for what her family had lost, but it was something real. It was acknowledgement. And for Donna, that turned out to matter more than she had expected. Daniel and Claire got engaged in the spring, on a hiking trail in the Smoky Mountains near the town in Kentucky where Claire had grown up. He called me from the trail, so out of breath he could barely get the words out, and I sat down on my back porch step and laughed and told him I had known since the blackberry jam. Claire's mother came to visit in June. She was a small woman with work-worn hands and the kind of quiet dignity that people develop when they have spent a long time doing difficult things without complaint. We sat at my kitchen table and drank coffee and talked for 4 hours. She told me about Claire as a little girl, about the scholarships and the early mornings, and the years Claire had worked 2 jobs and come home exhausted and still studied until midnight. I told her about Daniel, the little boy who had cried at the vet when our dog was sick and had decided at age 9 that he wanted to fix things that were broken. By the time she left, we were not strangers anymore. I have been asked, since then, whether I regret how that dinner went, whether I wish I had done it differently or more privately, or not at all, whether it was worth the family fracture, the legal proceedings, the long, uncomfortable months of Patricia's anger and Gerald's silence, and the rearrangement of relationships that had existed for 30 years. I think about Robert when I answer that question. I think about him sitting at a desk, going through documents he would never use, building a case he would never make, writing my name on the outside of an envelope because he wanted someone to carry it after he was gone. He was a quiet man. He was not built for confrontation. He handled injustice the way a lot of decent people handle it. He documented it carefully and bore the weight of it privately and hoped that eventually the right moment would arrive. The right moment arrived at a dinner table in October. I do not regret standing up. I regret that it took as long as it did. I regret that a woman who worked 2 jobs to keep her daughter in school ever had to sit at a table and hear the word modest used as an insult. I regret that Donna Whitfield spent 50 years wondering why her family always seemed to be just behind. I regret that Robert never got to make it right himself. But regret and action are 2 different things, and one of them changes the world. Claire stood with me in my kitchen 3 weeks before the wedding, helping me pit cherries for a pie the way my mother used to make. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she had been thinking about that night at Patricia's house. She said she had never told anyone this, but when Patricia had given that toast, for just a moment she had wondered if she belonged there. Not in Daniel's life, she never doubted that, but at that table, in that world. She had looked at the paintings on the wall and the caterer in the white jacket, and she had thought about her father's bad back and her mother's cleaning supplies, and she had felt, for one terrible moment, like a visitor. She said watching me stand up had changed something in her. She said it was the first time in a long time that she had felt like she was not just allowed to be somewhere, but actually entitled to be there, welcomed, seen for the right things. I put down the spoon and I looked at her and I said I needed her to hear something clearly. I said the table we were sitting at in my kitchen had been in my family for 40 years, and it had been pitted and scratched by 4 decades of ordinary living, and I was more proud of it than I ever was of anything in Patricia's dining room. I said her mother's hands were worth more than every oil painting on those walls. I said there was no version of this story in which she was the one who should have felt small. She looked at me for a moment, and then she put her arms around me, and I held on to her the way I had held on to Daniel when he was small and frightened. And outside my kitchen window, the afternoon was long and golden, and the cherry tree in the yard was doing that thing it does in late summer, where the light comes through the leaves and everything looks briefly, improbably like it is exactly what it was always supposed to be. Daniel came in from the backyard and found us like that, and he stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, and the look on his face was the look of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. I let go and picked up the spoon. I said we had pie to finish. I have thought about that envelope a great deal since then. About Robert leaving it for me, addressed in his careful handwriting, placed in the center of a desk drawer where he knew I would find it. I used to wonder if he had wanted me to use it sooner, if he had meant for it to happen while he was alive and simply could not bring himself to be the one. But I think now that he knew something I did not yet know when I found it. He knew that the right person needed to receive it first. Not me, not him, Claire. She was the reason it mattered. She was the person Patricia had looked at across that table and found wanting, and she was also the person who had worked through cold mornings and financial anxiety and the specific exhaustion of building something from nothing, And she had done it without bitterness and without apology, and she deserved to know that the woman doing the judging had no ground under her feet. That was what the envelope was really for. Some truths are patient. They sit in desk drawers for years, waiting for the right table, the right room, the right moment when someone is about to be made to feel like less than they are. They wait because they know that the people who hide behind false histories always eventually get comfortable. They always eventually stand up in a room full of people and say something they should not say. And when that moment comes, all you need is the courage to reach into your bag. I joined this channel because I wanted to talk about the things women my age are not supposed to say out loud, about the moments we chose silence because it was easier, and about the moments we finally did not, about the long work of protecting the people we love in the slow, quiet ways that no one ever sees, and about the rare moments when the work becomes visible. This is one of those moments. If you are sitting somewhere right now and you have been made to feel like you come from the wrong place, like your beginnings are something to apologize for, or overcome, or transcend, I want you to hear something from a 63-year-old woman who has been watching people like Patricia her entire life. They are always protecting something. Always. And they are always more frightened than they look. The truth is not their friend. It never has been. That is why they work so hard to make you feel too small to speak it. You are not too small. You never were.